Today we begin a new series of studies in the three books of Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther. But before we begin the series, it's helpful to know the historical setting to these three often neglected books of the Bible. Around 1000 BC, the famous King David finally established the Israelite people as a proud nation and empire. An empire which reached its glorious zenith under his son Solomon. However, as a result of the folly of Rehoboam, Solomon's son, the kingdom divided into two parts. One based around Samaria and known as Israel, the other centered on Jerusalem and named Judea. Tragically, both kingdoms failed to remain faithful to Yahweh, their God, and despite warnings from messengers sent by him, they refused to return to him. As a result, Israel was overthrown by the Assyrians in 722 BC and disappeared entirely from the historical records. Later, Judea also fell to the Babylonians, Jerusalem being finally overpowered by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. Most of the people, certainly all their leaders, were exiled to Babylon. However, Yahweh's messengers had consistently promised that after a period of about 70 years, a small remnant of the Judean exiles would return. This must have seemed impossible. However, in 539 BC, Cyrus the Persian overthrew Babylon, and he established a policy in which exiled peoples could return to their former homelands. This is where the book of Ezra starts. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a group of exiles did return and commenced rebuilding the temple. And we shall see that this is described in Ezra chapter 1 to 4. Sadly, however, faced with opposition, the work ceased a few years later, around about 534 BC. Meanwhile, Cyrus had died, and was eventually succeeded by Darius, known as Darius the Great, who was married to Cyrus's daughter Atossa. Darius, we shall also discover, has a part to play in the book of Ezra. After Darius came to the throne in 522 BC, Haggai and his companion Zechariah, whose own books are contained in the Bible collection known as the Minor Prophets, encouraged the resumption of the rebuilding of the temple. Permission having been granted by Darius, the work was completed about 515 BC, when it was rededicated. Darius's long reign ended with his death in 486 BC, and he was succeeded by his son Xerxes, who reigned for the next 20 years. Xerxes is the king who figures in the story of Esther. He was assassinated in 465 BC and was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes I, who reigned until 424. And it's during his reign that Ezra arrived in Jerusalem to undertake the religious reforms that are described in Ezra chapter 7 to 10, roughly speaking around 458 or 457 BC. About a dozen years later, Nehemiah, one of the senior officials in Artaxerxes' court, arrived in Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of the city. Now, with this knowledge of the history, we can commence our studies in the three books of Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther, each of which contain dramatic stories that, as God's words, contain much from which we can learn in our walk with him. So we start with the first chapter of Ezra. And it will be helpful if you have your own Bible open at this point in the Bible, as it will help our study together. And at the end, as there will be for all our studies, there will be a question or questions to reflect upon. The book of Ezra starts with the word "and," which is omitted in some versions of the Bible, and this was as strange and ungrammatical a way to start a new book in Old Testament times as it will be today. However, there's a reason for it. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Daniel precedes Ezra. Thus the "and" links Ezra to Daniel and tells us that the two books of Ezra and Nehemiah begin to describe the fulfillment of God's promises that had been made to Daniel, one of Yahweh's messengers, who had risen to leadership in Babylon. But of course, that's another story. But for many years, as we've already seen, the people of Judah had been exiled in Babylon. They'd been taken there by Nebuchadnezzar. However, the reason they were there was that God was punishing them for their repeated failure to live for him and his glory. Nevertheless, as we've already noticed, he had promised that they would return home. And Ezra begins in chapters 1 to 6 by showing how God was faithful to these promises. Specifically, we are told of the return of the people, what awaited them, their initial attempt to rebuild the temple, the opposition that they faced, which led to the cessation of the work, and finally their rallying after 20 years and their completion of the work. The second part of the book, chapters 7 to 10, described the beginning of Ezra's ministry over 60 years later. In the present chapter, there are three things that are especially emphasized. The first is God's faithfulness. Daniel was not the only one of Yahweh's messengers who had predicted the return of a group of Judahites to their former lands. Jeremiah had done the same, so the first verse of the present chapter picks up the reference to the return in Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 10, words that were also reported in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 verses 20 and 21. God is faithful, even when his people had been faithless. Even more remarkable is the fact that another of God's messengers, Isaiah, had 200 years before given the name of the person under whom this would all take place, Cyrus. You'll find this mentioned in Isaiah 44 verse 28. Finally, attention is drawn in this passage to the preservation of the furnishings of the temple. We see this in verses 9 to 11. They might easily have been melted down and used to decorate some of the Persians' great building projects, but no, they'd been preserved, and Cyrus restored them to the small group of Judahites who returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and re-establish its services. In each of these things, the Lord God is seen as faithful and able to accomplish his purposes, even accomplishing it from a most unlikely direction. Who would have expected pagan King Cyrus to have acted in the way that he did and reversed the policy of ethnic cleansing of conquered people which had so characterized all of his predecessors? One of the great lessons which the two books of Ezra and Nehemiah are intended to teach us is that God really is in control even of the greatest nations and rulers. Cyrus was like the presidents of Russia, China and USA all rolled into one, since Babylon was the great world power at the time. The Lord's plans are not hindered by the greatest of men or women. He will do what he has promised. And this is true not only on the international level as here, but also in your small corner and mine. He is faithful. One of the most interesting things about this chapter is the way that the return from Babylon is seen as being like the Exodus all over again. 200 years earlier, Isaiah, whom we've already met, had spoken of the deliverance from Babylon in language drawn from the time when God used Moses to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. If you've time, you might look, for example, at Isaiah 43, 14 to 21 and 48, 20 to 21. And this same idea is picked up here. Thus verses 4 and 6, which refer to the collection of valuables to help fund the work of the temple, use words found in Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 and 36, where the Israelites collected resources from the Egyptians to source their own exodus. In addition, the phrase family heads was used in the wilderness of the leaders of Israel. So the return from Babylon is being described here as a new exodus. But if there are similarities, there are also great differences upon which we're surely intended to reflect. So at the Exodus, the people of God had been delivered from Egypt and brought into Palestine, where they formed an independent state. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, the nation had no political freedom, Now they were a distinct community, but within a great world empire. Their distinguishing marks are now the house of God, the altar, and the book, as we will see in the following studies. Then secondly, at the Exodus all the people had come out of Egypt. Here only a very small remnant returned to Jerusalem, those whose hearts, we are told, had been moved to do so by God. And finally we notice that under Moses the people had been a great military power. Here they are simply a small group whose greatest concern is the faithfulness of their service to God. The following questions will help you and I work out how these lessons apply to each of us.